Hey guys, and welcome back to my true crime channel. Today's video is going to be, as you could tell from the title, the case of OJ Simpson. This is a very, very famous case, and I hope to do it justice by talking about it today. And this also kicks off the new series that I'm going to be starting, which is celebrity cases, high-profile cases, very more well-known cases, basically. And I thought this would be the perfect one to start on since so many people have already heard of it. I hope to give a couple of facts that you guys haven't heard of before, some things that I found interesting when I was researching this case. This case ended up having a very interesting outcome on society. I also did want to mention that there was a Netflix show called American Crime Story, and they did one on the case of OJ Simpson, and it was called OJ versus the People. This show is really good at giving background into, I would say, more the lawyers and more of the behind-the-scenes stuff rather than giving more information about OJ, Nicole, and Ron. That show is basically all about the trial, so if you want to watch something that is all about the trial, then I would really recommend that show. I actually really liked that show. I did want to point out, though, that it's always important when watching true crime shows and shows that are based off of real things that have happened to remember that they will often dramatize things to an extreme degree and sometimes flat out fabricate things to make for a more entertaining or interesting show to watch. So just keep that in mind and don't take everything that is said in those true crime, I guess, mockumentaries or dramatizations or anything like that. Don't take everything that they do as fact. Without further ado, let's get into the case. So Orenthal James Simpson was born in San Francisco, California on July 9th, 1947, and OJ went to Galileo High School where he played football, first as a tackle, then as a fullback. And he also went on to attend the University of Southern California, where he got recognition for being the best college football player in the country. He was named All-American, he played in 2 Rose Bowls, and won the Heisman Trophy. During this time, he also got nicknamed Juice, or, OJ. They would often say that the juice is loose when he would run super far and super fast, which is what he was known for doing. He went on to have a pretty successful career in the NFL as well. He was on the Buffalo Bills from 1969 to 1977, and then he was on the San Francisco 49ers between 1978 and 1979. He became the first player to carry the ball for more than 2,000 yards in one season in 1973. And some other achievements in his football career include most rushing yards gained in one season, most rushing yards gained in a single game, and most touchdowns scored in one season. So in 1983, 4 years after he retired from football, he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But after retiring from the NFL, OJ used the fame that he had gotten from the NFL to his advantage, and he went on to become a pretty popular broadcaster and actor in a few Hollywood movies. Well, for broadcasting, he would usually commentate on the NFL. He would feature in commercials, mostly for Hertz rental car.
Nobody does it better than Hertz.
Nobody does it better. Hertz leads the others by far. Nobody does it best of all. You, Hertz, the superstar.
Nobody has more of what it takes to rid you of Fairmont, Mustang, LTD, or other fine car faster.
Hertz, the superstar.
You know it.
And he would also attend many Hertz-sponsored golf events where he would play golf there. He would go on to star in more than 20 movies, the most notable of these including The Towering Inferno and the Naked Gun movies, which is what he's most known for. And this is something that I found super interesting about the case when I was researching it, but he actually starred in a movie called The Klansman, and that's actually about a man being framed for murder by the police. So it's pretty ominous considering what happens later. OJ during this time was married to a woman named Marguerite Whitley. However, this did end up ending in separation and divorce. Something else that I had never heard of before was a year into their separation, OJ's first child from the marriage with Marguerite Whitley actually drowned in the Rockingham Mansion pool, which I had never heard anybody mention before, that he had other kids besides the kids that he has later. And when he was still married to this wife, Marguerite Whitley, and I do believe that they were separated at this time, he met a 17-year-old waitress at a club that he would frequent, and her name was Nicole Brown. The two fell in love pretty instantly and would go on to get married in 1985, and 7 months later they had their first child together. And although Nicole would often tell all of her friends and family that she suffered from domestic violence at the hands of OJ, OJ denied ever laying a finger on Nicole and said that sometimes her bruises and her scratches were the results of what he called wrestling, which was normal in marriage according to him. I think it's also important to mention, especially given what happens later, that OJ, throughout his time of being a celebrity through the NFL and then, becoming a more mainstream celebrity in movies and as a broadcaster, he always maintained a super friendly and good relationship with the LAPD. He usually invited officers over to his Rockingham mansion, and he would attend police events that they would throw. And typically, whenever police would be called by Nicole for domestic violence, OJ would never be charged with anything. He would never get any consequences because he had such a great relationship with the police. The one exception to this was from a police officer named Mark Furman, which again, remember that name, it's going to be important later. And he did actually charge OJ with domestic violence, and this was the only time that OJ was really charged with a domestic violence charge. Now let's learn a little bit about Nicole. So Nicole Brown was born on May 19th, 1959 in Frankfurt, West Germany. And she was born to a German mother named Juditha Ann Brown and an American father named Louis Heiseko Brown. And they met when Louis was stationed in West Germany, and he was a correspondent for the American Armed Forces publication called Stars and Stripes. Now, the family initially did set up roots in Frankfurt in Germany when they had Nicole, and then they ended up having her sister Denise. However, when the girls were toddlers, they decided to move the family back to America where Louis was from, and they went to Garden Grove, California. After this, they ended up having 2 more daughters, Dominique and Tanya. Now, Nicole really loved living in California. Everyone she met seems to love her. She had a sort of magnetic energy that drew you to her. And she was just a really fun-loving and nice person that everybody wanted to be around. During her teen years, she was also often found at the beach. She loved to go to the beach. And she also attended Rancho Alamitos High School. During her senior year, however, she transferred to Dana Hills High School, and she was actually named Homecoming Princess at this high school. Now, before she was even 18, Nicole started working at an upscale Beverly Hills club called The Daisy. Now, during this job, she was introduced to OJ, who was a frequent customer, and she was introduced through her manager. Although he was still married at the time, it didn't take long, as we know, for the two to connect and fall in love. And in 1979, OJ ended up divorcing his wife after he had begun a relationship with Nicole. Now, in 1985, OJ Simpson and Nicole Brown got married and ended up having 2 children together named Sydney and Justin. Everyone describes Nicole as an extremely devoted mother, and she loved being a mother. She took a lot of pride in her parenting style, and she just loved being a mother to her 2 children. Typically, people at her status and level of celebrity, especially living in the areas that they did, would hire a nanny, and the nanny would take their kids to events at school and kind of take care of the kids a little bit more often than the parents would even. However, Nicole refused to do this, and she went to every single one of her children's events, games, concerts, any of that stuff that her kids wanted to be in, and if her kids were interested in something, she was going to make sure that they had the opportunity to do it. At this time, she also began a small interior decorating business just to have something to do while her kids were at school, and she didn't really have to work because of the level of celebrity that OJ was at. OJ and Nicole's relationship was extremely tumultuous and filled with domestic violence, as well as OJ just in general being extremely unfaithful to Nicole. Throughout their relationship, there was a reported 62 incidents of abuse. In 1989, they even had a New Year's party. They threw a New Year's party where OJ allegedly threatened to kill Nicole. And after this, he ended up pleading no contest to spousal battery. However, he didn't really suffer any consequences for that. He didn't serve jail time. He didn't have to, as far as I know, pay a fine or anything like that. He basically got a slap on the wrist, and they said that they did something by, charging him for it, but he didn't really end up facing any consequences for this. Now, in 1992, Nicole ended up filing for divorce after years of abuse at the hands of OJ, and they were only married for a total of 7 years, but after their divorce, Nicole alleged that OJ began stalking her, and everywhere she went, he would be too. Besides that, Nicole was really thriving in her new single life. She really enjoyed being single again and not feeling abuse at the hands of OJ anymore. She had received a $433,000 settlement from her divorce and was receiving $10,000 a month in child support from OJ. And she would often be seen showing up to her children's events that she would go to in her white Ferrari. Most days would try to go out dancing with her friends. So she was really thriving at this time. However, the stalking was unfortunately far from over. Nicole told her mother at the time, "I'm scared. I go to the gas station, he's there. I'm driving and he's behind me." They did try to reconcile the relationship. However, by 1994, after all this on again, off again, Nicole completely cut off the relationship and said it was over. And that brings us to the evening of June 12th, 1994. Nicole and OJ were both at their daughter Sydney's school dance recital. And after attending the recital, Nicole ended up dining at a restaurant called the Mezzaluna with her children and her parents, before deciding to head home and call it a night. After she returned home, her mother, Juditha, told her that she had left her glasses at the restaurant accidentally. But luckily, Nicole did have a friend who worked at the restaurant named Ron Goldman. And after calling Ron, he agreed that he would bring the glasses back to Nicole's house when he finished his shift later that night. At approximately 10 p.m., on the night of June 12th, Nicole and Ron were both brutally stabbed outside of Nicole's townhouse. Nicole was 35 and Ron was just 25. Let's get into a little background on Ron Goldman and who he was. Now, before I even get into Ron, I did want to mention that I really didn't like when I was researching that there is so much less information about Ron than there is about OJ and Nicole. I understand that they were more high profile and there would be more information on them out there. However, I found many things that didn't even respect him even after his death, and it's kind of saddening. I wanted to find and give as much information about him as I possibly could because he is just as much a victim as Nicole in this and deserves just as much justice. With that being said, let's get into Ron Goldman. So Ronald Lyle Goldman was born on July 2nd, 1968 in Buffalo Grove, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. And Ron had one younger sister, and they were both raised by their father after his parents got a divorce in 1974. He attended Twin Groves Junior High School and Adlai Stevenson High School. He was known at school as a kind, skinny kid who played soccer and tennis. And Ron ended up graduating high school in 1986 and went on to attend Illinois State University. After his family decided to relocate to California, however, Ron ended up dropping out after only 1 year in college to follow them to California. Now, during this time, Ron was working a bunch of different jobs, some odd jobs, some part-time jobs. He was really trying to find himself during this time. A couple of these included like a tennis instructor and a waiter. He was a very healthy person and prided himself on this. He would go to the gym really often and would avoid all alcohol. And his main dream was to be a restaurateur and own his own restaurant someday. I know that there was like this rumor that he was like a male model, and although he did do, I think, a couple of modeling shoots, he by no means was a male model that was like often modeling, and he by no means wanted that to be his career path. He was not like an aspiring model, aspiring actor, any of that. He wanted to own a restaurant, and that was his main dream that he had. After Ron started working as a waiter at Mezzaluna in Brentwood, he met Nicole, and they became friends, but they were by no means very close. The closest they ever were when sometimes Nicole would let Ron try driving her Ferrari, which really excited him. And on the night of June 12th, 1994, as we know, Ron offered to drop the glasses off at Nicole's house. He did have plans to go out with another friend that night after briefly stopping by Nicole's house. He would never get to go to the other friend's house. So just after midnight on June 13th, a neighbor was walking and noticed a white Akita dog was walking all by itself, and it had blood on its paws, and it was tracking bloody paw prints. So the man decided to follow the dog, and this dog actually ended up being Nicole's white Akita dog, and it led the neighbor to finding Nicole and Ron's bodies. Nicole and Ron were found surrounded by huge amounts of blood outside of her home in Brentwood. At this time, they had been laying there for at least 2 hours. Nicole was found barefoot. She had stab wounds to her head, to her neck, to her hands. Her throat was cut with such force that she was nearly decapitated. Ron's body was found beneath a tree next to a fence, and he had similar stab wounds all over his body. He also was found with the envelope that had the glasses that he was returning in them to Nicole. When the coroner was examining the bodies, the first thing he said was that the wounds and injuries were consistent with an attack by a very large and strong man. He also knew that Nicole was attacked from the back and was just incapacitated while the murderer went to attack Ron, and then came back to finish killing Nicole after he or she had killed Ron. In the reconstruction, they said the whole thing could not have lasted more than about 5 minutes max. After the murders, the police realized that they need to tell OJ that his ex-wife, recently divorced ex-wife, has been murdered in such a way. So when 3 Los Angeles detectives went to OJ's Rockingham house, which is also in Brentwood, to inform him about the murder of Nicole, they were actually not able to find him, and it didn't seem like he was home. But earlier that night, we find out that OJ had taken a flight to Chicago. I believe that this was for filming a Hertz rental car commercial that was in Chicago. While detectives were at his Rockingham house, even though they did not find him, they did find a couple of key evidence things that ended up being a little suspicious to them. First, he left his Ford Bronco there because, as we find out later again, he was picked up by a driver that night, so he did not drive himself. So his Ford Bronco was still sitting in his driveway, and they did notice that there was blood smeared on the door of his Ford Bronco. And upon searching some of the property grounds, they also did find a bloody glove that matched the glove that was found at the crime scene of Nicole and Ron's bodies. The detectives realized that they couldn't do much more searching without a warrant, so the detectives returned later that morning with a search warrant in hand, and then they ended up finding bloodstains inside of the Bronco, as well as more blood found on a pair of socks found in OJ's bedroom. Once OJ started to get a little suspicious in terms of thinking that the police might suspect him of being the murderer, he talks to his longtime friend, who was also kind of a celebrity, named Robert Kardashian, who we now know as the father of all of the Kardashians. Robert Kardashian was actually a lawyer, so he suggested hiring a famous celebrity lawyer. He recommended a famous litigator named Robert Shapiro. OJ took his advice and ended up hiring Robert Shapiro as his lawyer. On the morning of June 17th, police charged OJ with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was arranged to surrender midday. They wanted to do this to be respectful of his celebrity status, and they wanted to save him the embarrassment of a public arrest if they just came to arrest him. But when the time came for him to surrender, he was nowhere to be found. And it turns out OJ had fled the city with his friend Al Cowlings, also known as AC, in his white Ford Bronco. Now this is AC's white Ford Bronco, not OJ's white Ford Bronco. OJ's white Ford Bronco was still being used to collect evidence, but AC had bought in the same car as him because he liked him so much. With him, he had a disguise, a passport, and about $8,800 in cash. After realizing that OJ had fled, District Attorney Gil Garcetti released a statewide manhunt in order to find OJ. This attempted escape was filmed by helicopters following the Bronco overhead when they finally found him, after a couple of tips had come in from other drivers on the road. And this became a phenomenon that people watched happen from their TVs. The kind of funny thing is, though, it wasn't like a cool high-speed car chase where like they're just zooming and following OJ down, the freeway. They actually were just going incredibly slowly, and OJ and AC were just driving incredibly slowly, and then the police were all just following him incredibly slowly. Even though they had shut down the highway during this time to get OJ, they still kind of just did whatever he wanted and just slowly followed behind him. They ended up driving for around 60 miles before surrendering to the police.
Been going on down below as the presumed vehicle of OJ Simpson is still traveling very slowly northbound along the 5 freeway, coming up again towards the 91 intersection. At that point, we'll just have to wait and see which way he's going to go, but at this point, it's still a fairly laid-back situation, dangerous situation at the same time, because again, the Highway Patrol does not want to intimidate, and I repeat, do not want to intimidate this vehicle into doing anything that they really don't want him to do, and the main thing is to get him pulled over as safely as possible, and there's only a couple ways that'll happen. One is him just pulling over and or running out of gas. So at this point, we can only pray that they'll be able to pull this off in a safe measure.
It is believed that OJ was thinking of ending his own life because he had left behind a letter which stated, "I have had a great life, great friends. Please think of the real OJ and not this lost person." Robert Shapiro and Robert Kardashian had found this letter while OJ was on the run. Robert Shapiro even held a press conference during this time in an attempt to save face while OJ was on the run and probably not looking the best.
First to OJ, wherever you are, for the sake of your family, for the sake of your children, please surrender immediately. Surrender to any law enforcement official at any police station, but please do it immediately.
Robert Kardashian also read the letter that was left behind by OJ to everyone during this conference. When taken into questioning, police noted right away that OJ gave very vague, not clear responses. He didn't really answer any of their questions. He kind of just brushed off all of their questions, and he failed to establish any kind of timeline, and anytime they would try to hold him to a timeline, he would kind of just say, "Oh yeah, that's what I meant, Now we're getting into the infamous trial of the century. In January of 1995, OJ's trial began in downtown Los Angeles, and this trial was heavily televised. Like, the entire trial, I know that we have a lot of trials nowadays that are, especially with celebrities, they televise the entire thing, and people can just watch it, like live stream it from their, computers, iPads, phones, whatever. During this time, that was not a thing, and they were canceling regularly broadcasted programs, sports events, TV shows, soap operas, anything like that. They were, cutting over these shows to put the trial. That's how invested everybody was in watching this trial go down. The prosecution was led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, and Marcia Clark typically did take on domestic violence cases, and she felt very passionately about this case and getting justice for Nicole. And we have the defense team, also known as OJ's Dream Team, who was made up of Robert Kardashian, who, as I said, was actually a lawyer, so he just had to renew his license to practice in California, Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, and Robert Shapiro. Now, Judge Lance Ito was chosen to preside over the trial, and they also started jury selection, which ended up actually being a very long and tedious process, since they had to find people who didn't know anything about OJ and didn't have anything that could interfere with the case, which is very common. So they have to cut out any people that have histories with domestic violence, with being abused by men, with anything like that, so that if they had any preconceived notions about this case, they were not allowed to be in the jury. Although under California law, OJ was eligible for the death penalty for these crimes, the DA, Gil Garcetti, thought it would be better just to ask for a life sentence since he was a celebrity and public figure. In general, death penalty cases are much harder to prove and to win. So in that way, it was a good idea. And I also do think that it would have been much harder for a jury to convict a celebrity to be sent to death. During the beginning of the trial, when it had first started, a Time magazine had been replaced, and on the cover, they put OJ's mugshot. And in this image, they did darken his skin tone and made him appear darker. This led to a huge outrage among fans of OJ and just people in general watching this go down, that the media was already being racist in the way that they were portraying OJ, and they were trying to take down a black man in power, is how a lot of people saw it. Also during this time, one of Nicole's longtime friends named Faye Resnick published a novel all about Nicole's life and her personal relationship with Nicole, and this actually ended up detracting a lot from the prosecution because it leaked potential evidence to the public that the prosecution planned on using, but now they were unable to use it as new evidence. The trial wanted the jury to look at OJ's house and tour OJ's house, and this is something that they do in certain trials. It said that the defense, especially Johnny Cochran, went into the house prior to the jury being able to tour it, and he sort of staged it in a way that made OJ look a lot better. Beforehand, before the staging of the house, his house was very much a bachelor pad, right? He had pictures of naked women, beers and alcohol and all this stuff. He had all of these things that would be in a typical man's bachelor pad when he is not married and doesn't have kids staying with him. However, Johnny took all of this away, or the defense took it all away, and they replaced it all with more family stuff. So they replaced, the naked women pictures with pictures of OJ and his mother and OJ and his kids to make him seem more like a family man and somebody that only cared about his family at the end of the day. They also included some African tribal statues and paintings in order to make OJ seem more connected to his African American heritage and almost more proud of it, even though originally he had more pictures of him hanging out with his white golf buddies and white police officers. They took all that down and replaced it with this other stuff. The main arguments of the trial was that the prosecution would argue that Nicole's death was the tragic ending of years of domestic abuse that she suffered because of OJ, and that Ron had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time and suffered a tragic ending as well. They told the jury all about OJ's history of violence towards Nicole. They even played some of Nicole's 911 calls that she had made during the relationship, which was pretty powerful and also proved that Nicole was scared of OJ. Something important for the prosecution to drive home to the jury was that OJ did not have any alibi for the night of the murders. They brought in Kato Kalin, who lived in the guest house at OJ's property right next to his house. He testified that he did not see OJ at all between 9:36 and 10:45 p.m. And this was the exact time that the prosecution speculates that the murders occurred. In total, the prosecution showed that there was 61 drops of blood that linked OJ to this crime. At one point, at the beginning of the trial, the defense tried to introduce some new witnesses without clearing it with the prosecution, which is actually illegal in a court of law. This caused one of the prosecutors, William Hodgman, to actually have a panic attack and collapse in the middle of court, and he ended up being carried away on a stretcher. This was pretty crazy because it just showed how much stress all of these lawyers were under trying to, either prove or disprove this case. And this was at the time where William Hodgman was the co-prosecutor with Marcia Clark. However, at this time, it was found that William Hodgman was under too much pressure and could not be a co-prosecutor anymore. So that's when they brought in Christopher Darden, who was originally not at the level of a prosecutor. He was right underneath it, and he was just helping with the case. That is when he got upgraded to a full co-prosecutor with Marcia Clark. Marcia Clark was also going through a difficult time through this whole trial. Not only was she going through a really bad divorce at the time and trying to deal with custody of her children, the media was also just constantly criticizing her about everything, which, looking back, I don't think is really fair. They would criticize things that she can't really control, such as her appearance, and they would also minimize her divorce, and they would minimize her problems that she would have finding childcare while she was working 12 plus hours a day on this case. I don't think it was very fair the way that she was treated during this case, and I do feel pretty bad for her. On the other hand, the defense tried to plant as much doubt into the jury's mind as possible. They claimed that OJ was the victim of corrupt policemen and tampered evidence. And they stated that the detectives had made very crucial mistakes in all aspects of the investigation, including wearing dirty gloves, which can cause contamination when finding evidence. To explain the glove that was found at his property, the defense argued that Mark Furman, who was a lead detective on the case, had planted it there. And they also went on to play tapes for the court that showed a very blatant history of racism on Mark Furman's part. This was especially bad when earlier in the trial, Mark Furman said under oath when being cross-examined by F. Lee Bailey that he had never used any racial slurs in his life. However, once the tapes were played, that was blatantly untrue. And this allowed the defense to use racism as a motive for why the LAPD would want to frame OJ. Although Mark Furman had previously been a very key witness for the prosecution since he was the lead detective, he was familiar with all the evidence and the case, he knew exactly what he was talking about. When being cross-examined once again and being confronted with the fact that he lied under oath by F. Lee Bailey, he pled the fifth to everything that they asked him. So they asked him about 5 questions to begin with. Once they realized that he was pleading the fifth to everything, F. Lee Bailey then asked him, have you tampered any evidence or manufactured anything in this case? And Mark Furman pled the fifth, which ended up being very disastrous and very bad for the prosecution.
Detective Furman, would you please resume the witness stand? All right, good afternoon, Detective.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
You're reminded, sir, that you were still under oath. Mr. Ullman, you may proceed.
Detective Furman, was the testimony that you gave in this case completely truthful?
I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
Have you ever falsified a police report?
I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
Is it your intention to assert your Fifth Amendment privilege with respect to all questions that I ask you?
Yes.
I only have one other question, Your Honor.
What was that, Mr. Ullman?
Detective Furman, did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?
I assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
One person I didn't mention previously as being involved in this trial is Alan Dershowitz, who was an incredibly intelligent lawyer and professor who knew a lot about DNA at a time where DNA wasn't a science that was super well known. He argued that the DNA was tampered with, and this only further supported the notion that the whole case was just a framed murder on OJ. However, since DNA wasn't well known at the time, people didn't realize how conclusive of a science it really was, so that even if DNA is in some way tampered with, it would be impossible to manufacture a piece of someone's DNA in order to frame them for something, because DNA is a very conclusive thing. We all each have our own individual DNA. Towards the middle to end of the trial, the prosecution famously had OJ try on the gloves together in an attempt to prove his guilt even more. However, this ended up completely backfiring in the prosecution's faces because OJ attempted to put on the gloves but showed that they would not fit, and we end up finding out later that this is mostly because the gloves were in blood. Therefore, the gloves would have shrunk because when things are wet and they dry, they typically shrink. So after being exposed to blood for so long, the gloves had shrunk down, and that is why they most likely did not fit his hands, even though it was proven that he did buy those gloves. This allowed the defense to come in one of the most iconic moments of the trial, one of his lawyers, Johnny Cochran, yelled out, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit."
Your Honor, at this time, the people would ask that Mr. Simpson step forward and try on the glove recovered at Bundy as well as the glove recovered at Rockingham.
And I think so the jury can see, I'll ask Mr. Simpson to stand. That's People 77. Right.
Mr. Simpson seems to have problem placing the glove on his hand.
Sustained. This is People's 164A. Is that the right hand glove? All right. All right. Thank you, counsel.
Also importantly, Ron's family was also extremely outspoken during this time of their belief of OJ's guilt, and they said they would be getting justice no matter what. Whenever the Goldmans would talk to the media, they would also give just very tear-filled sentiments and heart-wrenching statements that were pretty devastating to hear. And his father would often say things like, he didn't deserve what happened to him. He was just living his life. This was between Nicole and OJ, and it's not fair that this happened to him. It is also important to mention that the problems with the jury at this time were happening, which the jury was kept extremely secluded from the rest of the world. This was for good reason, since the rest of the world was all talking about this trial, talking about OJ, whether you believed he was guilty or not guilty. Obviously, when you have a jury in such a high profile and also very important double homicide case, you can't have the jury be biased in any sort of way or have any view of anything other than what they are presenting to you in court. So the prosecution needs to either prove that he is guilty or the defense needs to prove that he's not guilty. You can't have any outside things clouding your judgment, basically. When the jury had been selected, they were told that they were only going to be there for a few weeks max, and they ended up being there for more than 8 months, which is almost a full year of just total seclusion from the outside world. They had no contacts to the families, really. They had no TV that they were allowed to watch in case the trial came up. And they couldn't even really talk to each other very much, especially about the trial. The only time they really got to talk to each other was at meal times, which the meals were always picked for them. I think it also is important to talk about, you can't talk about the trial of the century without talking about the atmosphere and political climate of society and the world during this time period. During this time, the Rodney King beatings had just happened a couple years prior. Once those were released and the videos came out and the police cam footage came out, everyone in America had to watch in horror as a man got brutally beaten by police officers. And this shifted public opinion about the police greatly, which wasn't the best to begin with anyways. The famous LA riots happened soon after this, where businesses, homes, streets in LA were set on fire, places were raided, violent crimes went up exponentially. And this also seems to cause a divide between races of people within LA. The trial was happening 2 years later. There was rumors that if OJ was found guilty, LA residents would start the riots all over again. And this was all exacerbated when it is obvious, looking back at the footage of the reveal from the trial, that it seems like people were pretty much split 50-50 on if they thought he did it or not. And it seemed divided by race. While some cried at the verdict and were devastated, others cheered and were happy about it. On the morning of October 3rd, 1985, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. After 8 months of being shown evidence after evidence, they deliberated for just 4 hours. And they acquitted OJ Simpson on all charges of murder. 2 years later, in February of 1997, OJ was taken to court for a civil lawsuit under the charges of wrongful death by the Goldmans and by the Browns. And he actually did end up losing this lawsuit and was ordered to pay $8.5 million to the Goldmans and $25 million to the Browns. Nicole was laid to rest at the Ascension Cemetery in Lake Forest, California. Ron's family had an unveiling of his gravestone in Jewish tradition and went on to establish the Ron Goldman Foundation for Justice. His family also inscribed on his tombstone the Egyptian symbol for eternal life called the Ankh. And this symbol meant a lot to Ron because he had this tattooed on his shoulder. He would wear that symbol around his neck. And nowadays, his sister Kim actually wears it in memory of her brother. What's happened since this infamous, iconic trial? Soon after the trial, OJ went on to say that he was going to find the real killers responsible for this, yet nothing ever really came from that. He never really did anything about it. And when others tried to investigate, it was found that no one else really had a motive to kill Nicole nor Ron. OJ had to watch as all of his high-profile friends in LA slowly started to disappear, including even Robert Kardashian. They all just started to slowly disappear, and nobody really wanted to spend time with him anymore, especially his previous friends. Some people stuck around, such as his family, his children, and his friend AC. But besides that, he didn't really have the same friend group and social network that he did prior to the trial. In 2007, a book was published written by OJ in collaboration with Pablo F. Fenives, and this book was titled If I Did It. This book basically detailed if he had done the murders, how he would have done it, and how it all would have transpired that night, basically. There was so much public outrage about this book, for good reason. It's kind of a huge slap into the face to Ron's family and to Nicole's family, and it just wasn't in good taste at all. It was initially supposed to be released in 2006, but the public reaction initially prevented its release. However, in 2007, a bankruptcy court ordered that all the book's rights would be awarded to the Goldman family, who ended up releasing the book anyways, and they were able to collect all of the earnings from that. Also in 2007, OJ was arrested once again after he was caught breaking and entering into a Las Vegas hotel room. And he claims that the man in the hotel had taken sports memorabilia that belongs to him, and that he was just trying to get it back. However, OJ was charged with multiple crimes, including armed robbery and kidnapping, among some of them. And the trial for this was set in 2008. In October 3rd, he was actually found guilty of all charges, and he was to serve a minimum of 9 years with a maximum of 33. OJ was later released on bail in 2017, and he currently stays on parole to this day, 2023. Clearly, that was a lot. I think that reflecting on everything, I think that the outcome of the trial happens the way that it had to happen. Do I believe that riots would have happened if OJ had been found guilty? Not necessarily, but I do think that it would not have been good, and I do think that it would have caused a lot of political and social disrupt, if that makes sense. And it would have caused a lot of problems within society if he had been found guilty. So I don't really have a strong opinion about that, but I do think that it happened for a reason, that he wasn't found guilty. Let me know what you guys think of this case. I did my best to try and present facts that weren't well known about the case, and also just create a cohesive timeline that made sense with everything. At the end of the day, regardless of if he was found guilty or not, Ron and Nicole still deserve justice, and I hope that they get it, and I hope that the families are at peace, and I hope that they are able to one day be able to make sense of this awful tragedy that happened. And it's really sad that Sydney and Justin have to grow up without Nicole, especially the way that everybody described her as a perfect mother. It's really sad that they won't have as many memories of that time with her. That's all for me today, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up if you found it interesting at all. And please do consider subscribing to my channel. That helps me out a lot. And let me know if there's any celebrity cases that you're interested in at all. I have a few ideas, but if there's one specifically that you're dying to hear about, just let me know and I'll do my research on it. And I will talk to you guys in the next video. Bye.